Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Well, it's the end of the week again, and I swear every single week passes by faster and faster it seems, but it's time to chat about what is happening in the freight market, what we can expect for next week, what happened last week, and so on. Now, if you're new to my channel, welcome. I teach about the trucking industry with a heavy focus on the spot market as well as freight market analysis. So if this is a topic that interests you, feel free to subscribe and join an amazing community. All right, let's dive right into the data and look at capacity, what is happening with carrier authorities. We'll take a look at diesel prices. We will look at what is happening in the general freight market with volumes and tender rejections, and how it's affecting the spot market for flatbeds, reefers, and dry vans. Ready? Let's go! All right, as always, we're going to start with the net change in carrier population. But before we actually start, I'm going to have to make a small kind of warning. I might be rambling today. I had way too much coffee. I'm going to try to edit this video as best as I can. But if you hear me rambling, it's the coffee, it's not me. Anyway, net changes in trucking authority. As of September 22nd, last week, Friday, we lost an additional 343 carriers net. Now, this is about 200 carriers more than the week before. Now, of course, it is not surprising that given the current market conditions, the carriers are slowly bleeding out of the market, or the capacity is slowly bleeding out. What is surprising, however, is the rate at which they are bleeding out given the current nightmare situation of the freight market. Now, there are some in this community that think that I am such a horrible person because I'm rooting for capacity, more capacity to leave. And you know what? You're absolutely right. I am rooting for just that. Is it nice that I'm rooting for people to basically go out of business? Of course not. But here is a little secret. The freight market, as well as any business, it doesn't care about your feelings. It doesn't care about my feelings. It only cares about numbers and making sure that they add up. Those who are not managing expenses, cash flow, and are taking cheap freight just to be able to say that at least their wheels are rolling, they are more likely to go out of business, not because they're bad people, not because they deserve it. God knows that no one deserves to lose their business. It's simply because the numbers don't add up when the operations are not micromanaged in the current situation, and basically the market forces these people out. So no, on a personal human level, I do not want people to lose their businesses. It's horrific. I can't imagine what would happen to me if I lost mine. But from a business perspective, of course, I'm rooting for capacity to exit the market in higher numbers. And it doesn't really go well with my personality, because my personality is these videos teaching people how to survive the current market. But those that do not follow the advice, those that continue taking cheap freight, those that do not manage their expenses, yes, unfortunately, the market is going to push them out right now. All right, now let's take a look at the general number of authorities. The white line is what we looked at right now, which is the net change. The red line is the net revocations, which did go down from last week if you look at it closely, which tells me that the reason the net change in carrier population went down more than the prior week is because less new carriers entered the industry last week. Now, the blue line is the total amount of MCs in the market, and we can see that it's still on a steep decline. Now, if we take a look at the total carriers in the market versus the total freight volume in the market, which is basically supply and demand, right? The white line is the volume, freight volume. The blue line is the total amount of carriers. Since the beginning of the year, volumes went up by 25.9% year to date, and this is up 1% from last week, whereas capacity decreased by 4.1% year to date, which is 0.1% more, I guess, than last week. Last week it was 4%. Year to date, negative 4%. All right, now for the outbound tender volume, which is in blue, versus outbound tender rejections. As we can see in the general freight market, volumes are continuing to slowly creep up. It's nothing crazy, but they are slowly creeping up. Whereas tender rejections, the white line, as I said last week, they did make a U-turn and they are kind of crashing, let's say. Currently, rejection levels are at 3.78%, and this is down from 3.9% last week. So that is not great, because the lower the rejections, the lower the volume on the spot market. So let's take a look at how this all changed week to week. Blue line volumes went up by 0.88%, which is nothing significant, but still better than what happened to rejections, where rejections fell by 2.33% since last week. Now, if we take a look at the contract versus spot market, we can see that contract carriers are currently on average getting 74 cents per mile more than those spot carriers. Now, the gap is decreasing between contract rates and spot rates, because last week it was 76 cents per mile more. So this gap is decreasing, but nevertheless, like I said last week, contract carriers in the contract market is pretty resilient. Finally, we have diesel prices, and this is the first time in a while where I have not good news per se, but it's a little bit better news than the weeks before. For the first time since the end of July, diesel prices actually went down on the national level. Last week they were $4.60 per gallon. Now they're $4.59 per gallon. So they went down by a whole cent per gallon. But if we take a look at the markets, we can see it's a little bit more hopeful. Again, as a reminder, red means there was a decrease in diesel prices, gray is pretty much no change, and green is an increase. For the most part, there are decreases, with the exception of the East Coast and the West Coast, where prices either stayed the same or they increased. No surprise there. All right, now on to flatbed specific data, starting with the spot market and volumes. As we can see, last week, volumes for the flatbed did decrease on the spot market, and this is the first time in a while where we're breaking away from that 5-year pattern, unfortunately. Now, in terms of spot rates, actually good news here. Spot rates slightly, ever so slightly increased last week for flatbeds. And they are currently at $2.35 average, whereas according to the 5-year average, we should be around the $2.40 mark with flatbeds. The good news is, for the most part, we're still following that 5-year pattern. The bad news is, if we continue following it, it's going to result in rates going down a little bit in the next few months. All right, we always look at the DAT load board, which reflects what is going on in the spot market. Unfortunately, Sonar doesn't have much data for flatbeds. And honestly, there's not much change. The Pacific Northwest still looks hot, as well as the South. Again, be careful with the Pacific Northwest because it can be misleading, right? The only good lanes are to dead markets. And if you're there on a Monday, then you're going to have a harder time as a flatbed carrier. However, something that I never showed, and I think it's important to show, is the flatbed load to truck ratio. The black line is us right now. What is the load to truck ratio? Well, it measures how many loads there are for every truck posted, right? If the load to truck ratio is low, that means the rates are not going to be good, whereas if it's high, it's better. So currently here we are, black line. Actually, we're right here, which I cannot highlight because I forgot to change my thing from white to a color. And we can see currently the load to truck ratio for flatbeds is at its lowest point since 2017. So of course, this explains why flatbed rates have been going down and down and down. Why could this happen? Either there is way too much capacity for the existing amount of loads, or the load volume is going down, right? It's one or the other. But basically, this shows us that the rates, it makes sense why the rates are not great right now, right? The load to truck ratio, there's a lot of competition at the moment. All right, now on to reefers, starting with load volumes on the spot market. Just like with the flatbed, load volumes went down last week and broke that 5-year pattern that we were so closely following there for a while. Now, in terms of spot rates, unfortunately, not good news here. They really deteriorated by about 5 cents per mile since last week. Currently, we're around the $2.35 per mile mark, whereas we should be, according to the 5-year average, at around $2.55. The only good news is that we're not breaking away from that 5-year pattern, and we can expect rates to continue decreasing until the end of October and then start creeping up in the beginning to middle of November. To be quite honest, in my experience with reefers, September and October have never been really good months for us, and now I know why. If we look at the general freight market in terms of volumes for reefers, we can see that for the most part, there is a breakdown in volume for reefers. It's either red or gray, which means that there was either a decrease in volume from last week or no significant change. Now, if we take a look at rejections, it's also not great, although there are market areas where rejections did increase. For example, North Dakota, parts of Minnesota, the Portland, Oregon area, Spokane, Washington, parts of it's Grand Junction, Colorado, North Carolina, parts of South Carolina, and Wisconsin. Everywhere else, especially in Michigan, you can see it's dark red. It means that the rejection rates really fell from last week. So the question is, where do you need to go next week if you have a reefer to grab relatively better opportunities? This is the map that shows you that, and let me read off the numbers. Number one, we have Twin Falls, Idaho right here, which is 35.89% rejection, which is a decrease of 5% since last week. Then we have Pendleton, Oregon, right here, the Pendleton, Oregon market, 38.44% rejection, a decrease of 2% since last week. We have Fargo, North Dakota right here, 35.18% rejection, and Minneapolis, Minnesota at 18% rejection, but be careful, there is low volume here. Unfortunately, it looks like the good markets this week are shrinking for reefers. And the Midwest, while still relatively better for reefers than anywhere else except for maybe the Pacific Northwest, it reduced in terms of rejection rates from 6 to about 15%, whereas last week we saw some areas that were showing over 20% rejection. So while I would still recommend keeping to the Midwest and hitting the Pacific Northwest next week with a reefer, something I want you to also realize is don't expect it to be as good as it was last week, because those rejections are falling across the board. Finally, we have dry vans. So in terms of spot market volumes, just like with the reefer and the flatbed, volumes decreased and broke that 5-year pattern. Not sure what is going on and why it's breaking that 5-year pattern. I have a feeling it has to do with these crashing rejection rates. Now, in terms of the spot rates for dry vans, unfortunately, there was a decrease by around 2 cents to $1.93 per mile average. Now, according to the 5-year pattern, we should be at around the $2.14 mark, but unfortunately, we are way below it. However, again, just like with flatbeds and with reefers, we are following the rate pattern. Now let's take a look at the volumes for dry vans, and unfortunately, it's even worse than for reefers. It looks like everywhere the volume broke down for dry vans, with the exception, a notable exception was Arizona, where for some reason volumes increased. There was also parts of Georgia where the volume increased quite a bit, but everywhere else, yeah, there are blue markets here and there, but for the most part, volume decreases galore. Now, in terms of rejections for dry vans, it's not as bad. We can see that the northern states had rejection increases. Some of the Midwestern states right here, we can see that Southern California, Nevada, Lincoln, Nebraska. The notable decrease in rejections was in Virginia for dry vans. So where do you have to go next week with a dry van to grab those relatively better opportunities? Well, we have the Green Bay, Wisconsin market, which is at 12.86%, a decrease of 0.5% since last week. We have the Rock Island, Illinois market right here, which is at 8.34%. And then we have the Des Moines, Iowa market, sorry if I'm mispronouncing it, 9.69% rejection right here. Just like with a reefer, dry van opportunities in terms of market areas that are relatively better, those shrunk from last week. But nevertheless, if I was a dry van operator, I would say if you want to keep in relatively better markets, even though they all got worse, you would keep somewhere in the Midwest, because these are markets that have higher rejection rates, they're close together, deadheading is not as painful. So my experience over the past week or so has been, it has been so-so. I didn't really see any drastic improvement, but I also didn't see any horrific deterioration. Basically, it's stable bad at the moment. But the one thing that has not changed over the past at least 6 months is the amount of work you have to put in for the tiniest result. It currently takes me on average 3 to 4 hours to find a more or less workable load that is decent, that covers the cost per mile and also brings a little bit of profit. Basically, the story of work harder and earn less is continuing. Personally, as weird as it sounds, I'm grateful for this experience. No, I'm not crazy, or at least not crazy enough to say that I'm enjoying the process at the moment. But I know that the skills that I learned over the past 2 years with this deteriorating market are going to really serve me in the future when things turn around. It's really going to allow me to propel the businesses forward. Remember, guys, there is something positive even in the most negative situations, whether it be a skill that you just acquired or maybe a lesson you learned. Take it one day at a time, manage the current situation to the best of your ability, and slowly this less than ideal environment in the trucking industry and the freight market too shall come to its end. Wishing you guys an amazing weekend, and I'll see you in the next video.